A very good Tuesday afternoon to each and every one of you. Spring is certainly in the air, so I can attest to that for sure with my allergies kicking up today. But we are happy regardless of that little yellow devil dust being in the air. We're so thankful to be together with you today and to be continuing our study through the book of the Judges. In fact, we're very quickly drawing to a close with this study. Today, we're going to be looking at chapter 20. And this upcoming Friday, we will be getting into chapter 21, finishing up and concluding this very dark text at times, but also a very insightful text, a text that we can learn much from. And we're going to do that hopefully today, looking at the really sad example of the state of Israel, as can be found in chapters 20 and then on Friday chapter 21. Thank you for being here, though. I hope this study has been a blessing to you as we've gone throughout this text of the Judges. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us. Let us know what you're thinking or any questions you might have. We'd love to discuss with you this text or any other spiritual subject that you might like to discuss. Please feel free to reach out to us either here in the comments or shoot us a private message on the Pleasant Plains Facebook page or the Pleasant Plains website. You can go there and reach out to us as well. Thank you so much for being here. Let's get into the text with my good friend Alan Seenestring. He is with us as always. Alan, we're going to continue down this dark road of Israel as we have swirled round and round and round in the fatal funnel.
I'm ready to finally get this Judges flushed away.
Yeah, we're finally to the bottom of the epilogue section of Israel, and there really is so much. I really appreciate Way's insight in showing just how interconnected these sections are of the Judges, how similar and yet contrasting the prologue and the epilogue are within this text. It's good to remember that this is the only Old Testament writing that has a true prologue and epilogue, and that works the way that we would think it would work in literature. But yet at the same time, what we're going to notice here is that this ancient writing doesn't exactly work the way that we would think it should work. And what I mean by that is working in a chronological events of what takes place, or a chronological line of the events that take place. It's not exactly linear, and we're going to see that today. But I believe it will give us some insight into the text. So Alan, why don't you kick us off, get into this first section, catch us up to where we are, maybe give a little background about what we saw just prior to this that gets us to where we are today.
Well, if you remember in chapter 19, we're introduced to yet another Levite. This is a different one from the man named Micah that we saw in the first two chapters of this epilogue, 17 and 18. And this Levite, it's kind of funny. This entire chapter, there's really no names involved in this at all, and we don't know the name of this Levite. We don't know really the names of any of the major players, the concubine, any of the men of Gibeah. There's no names, and I think that's kind of the point. This isn't just individuals. I think these stories are supposed to be kind of encompassing all of Israel, just to show that it's not just this one isolated event. It's stuff like this is happening throughout this time period. Just because we don't read about it doesn't mean that other just as bad things aren't happening. They just gave us this one to kind of fit into the story. So with that in mind, we can get into chapter 20, but just recall that this Levite was traveling. He went to go pick up his concubine back in Bethlehem. They were heading back home to wherever he was from, probably maybe Shiloh, wherever the tabernacle was. And instead of stopping in a Canaanite city, Jerusalem, they decided to keep going and stop in an Israelite city, Gibeah. Well, turns out that worse events happened in Gibeah of the Benjamites than would have happened probably if they'd have just stayed in a Canaanite city. So we have this story that's almost eerily similar to that of Lot and the two angels that visited him and the wicked Sodom and Gomorrah men. It's almost the exact same story. Well, now we have the consequence of that. The man had chopped up his dead concubine, sent the 12 pieces to all the 12 tribes, and now we've gathered together all of Israel to see what's going to be done about this here in chapter 20.
Right, and with that, this sending out of the pieces of his concubine, it is a call to action. We go back to chapter 19 and verse 23. Whenever the man whose house the Levite and his concubine are in, and the servants are in, whenever he says, "Don't commit this horrible outrage," that word there for outrage is something that demands retribution. Don't do this action, or it is going to demand retribution. Something's going to have to be done about it. We can't just sweep it under the rug, which is exactly what takes place at the end of chapter 19, leads us into chapter 20, when all the Israelites from Dan to Beersheba and from the land of Gilead came out, and the community assembled as one body before the Lord at Mizpah. The leaders of all the people and of the tribes of Israel presented themselves in the assembly of God's people, 400,000 armed foot soldiers. And the Benjamites heard that the Israelites had gone up to Mizpah. And the Israelites asked, "Tell us, how did this evil act happen? This outrage. I want to know, how did this happen?" And the Levites, the husband of the murdered woman, answered, "I went to Gibeah in Benjamin with my concubine and spent the night. And citizens of Gibeah came and attacked me." Notice the pronouns here. I believe it's very important to notice in this text. That's something that Way points out. Notice the pronouns. Who is he putting the crime against? When I went to Gibeah in Benjamin with my concubine to spend the night, and the citizens of Gibeah came to attack me and surrounded the house at night. They intended to kill me, but they raped my concubine and she died. And then I took my concubine and cut her in pieces and sent her throughout Israel's territory, because they had committed a wicked outrage. That's that same phrase from chapter 19 in Israel. And look, all of you are Israelites, give your judgment and verdict here and now. And then all the people stood united, which is interesting, and said, "None of us will go to his tent or return to his house. Now this is what we will do to Gibeah. We will attack it, and by lot we will take 10 men out of every 100 from all the tribes of Israel, and 100 out of every 1,000, and 1,000 out of every 10,000 to get provisions for the troops when they go to Gibeah and Benjamin, to punish them for all the outrage they committed in Israel." As I mentioned before, Alan, there are a number of important comparisons to make between what we find here in the epilogue to what we find in the prologue. And yet, even as we compare those things, within those comparisons are contrasts that show how far Israel has gone from what was taking place in the first chapter to what's taking place here in verse number 20. First of all, Alan, could you tell me, when was the last time that all Israel, from Dan all the way in the north to Beersheba all the way in the south, when was the last time in Judges we saw that taking place?
Ooh, I know they gathered at Mizpah during the days of Jephthah. That was the one I was thinking of, but probably all the way back in the first chapter here of I can't think of any time in between.
Probably can't think of any time because it hasn't happened.
Yeah, okay, good question.
In this way, you're correct in that in the first chapter there is this united effort for them to all go out and do this deed of conquering Canaan, but they didn't unite as a single body in order to do that. They just kind of all went their separate way in order to take over the territories that God had allotted to them so that they could have dominion over it. This is the very first time we see them all united as one people. Let's see, where's it at? They're verse 1. The community assembled as one body before the Lord. They hadn't done that up until this point, which is interesting and also kind of sad. It's sad that it took sin of their own people in order for them to gather together. And yet, as we look at this text, Alan, and specifically as we see what the Levite says beginning in verse 4, let's just say that this man would probably make a very good either prosecutor or defense lawyer. What he's talking about happened, but what is he doing here as he's given this testimony that maybe isn't exactly giving a very fair retelling of how things happened?
I mean, he kind of neglects any part of the story that might make him look bad. You know, he offered up this girl, him and the person in his house. They offered up another girl that they just didn't happen to take, I guess, because she lived there. But you know, he skillfully, you know, skirts around the parts that make him look bad and only recall the story that makes the men of Gibeah look bad.
Yeah, where is this man? And of course, if we're going back to chapter 19, there is a bit of ambiguity in verse 25. So the man seized his concubine. Could it be the old man seized the Levite's concubine? That's possible. It also could be that the Levite seized his own concubine and gave him. Notice that he doesn't say here that after my concubine had been offered up to these wicked men, that I went and got a good night's rest. Notice that it doesn't say that he doesn't mention how whenever she crawled to the threshold of the doorway, he wasn't sitting there waiting on her to check on her. He doesn't mention how whenever he opened up the door, he said 4 words to her: "Get up, let's go." And it doesn't mention that he did not seek to render aid to her. He doesn't mention any of that. He wants to show that he has been offended, and as a Levite, especially, and that's one of the things we mentioned in these first 2 chapters of the epilogue. The fact that these Levites, both this one who is unnamed, and then the previous one, Jonathan, who is named in chapter 18, who's also involved in chapter 17, that these Levites, they're bad men. And then there's no really any way to get around that. They're bad, wicked, evil men. They do not respect the Lord and his commandments, and they're certainly not behaving in a way that ought to be so for those who are part of the religious leadership of Israel. They're very wicked men, and he is going to use his status, and he is going to craft this narrative in a way that shows him as being wronged, and he wants to get his retribution against Gibeah for what they've done. And as we mentioned in our previous lessons, we're not convinced at all that there was any true love and affection, care that this man had for his concubine. She was nothing more than a piece of meat and a tool to be used. Though she was a legal spouse, a legal wife, she did not have the status of such. Any children they would have had would not have been in line for a blessing or inheritance. And he took it even further, that she's just a piece of meat. And because his piece of meat was chewed up and spit out by other people, well, now I'm going to try to get my revenge. I'm going to do so by trying to call all of Israel together.
And
so Alan,
this type of man that they unite around, we've.
Oh yeah, exactly. How horrible is this? If he's that bad and Israel is willing to unite around him, what does that say about Israel? Nothing good at all.
They've had at least some of the judges weren't terrible. The early judges, Othniel, Deborah.
Mm-hmm.
They've had some decent judges that we don't really know much bad happened. So they had good people they could rally around, but it's these bad ones that stir the most unity between them. You mentioned just how, this entire book of Judges, they're not really united at all, except when they're fighting themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So even then they're not really united, because that would include Benjamin. Well, Benjamin's not going to attack Benjamin. So they're not really even truly united. Even though it says the community assembled as one body, it's still 11/12 of the body, if you would. So yeah, this whole time, they're just always heading in the wrong direction. They're always doing the wrong thing. And you read up to verse 10, and I'm kind of scrolling down. It's about verse 18 till I even see a mention of God as well.
That's right. That's good observation.
This whole thing, they've gathered together. They've made this decision. Now we're going to go attack Gibeah. They're gathering. They're making all these decisions. Has there been an inquiry of God yet? And I think that's where we see some of the contrast. These verses here versus chapter 1.
That's right.
Chapter 1, verse 1, the Israelites inquired of the Lord. That's literally verse 1 before they do anything. And who are they attacking? They're attacking, Canaanites, like they're supposed to, start to cleanse the land. Well, up here, you're all the way to verse 18 before God's even mentioned, and and they're attacking themselves. So, how things have changed quickly.
Yeah, how unfortunate things have changed this quick. I want to read something. You mentioned the coming together as one, although they're not one.
Yeah,
they're sort of behaving as one. I like what Way says. He says, ironically, the dismembered body of the concubine is the occasion for this gathering of the unified body of Israel, which is about to dismember itself. It's about to cut off one of its own arms through going in by taking the word of this Levite and just following him wherever they felt they ought to go. They gathered together, Alan, in verse 11, and they gather united against the city. We're talking about Gibeah here, and what they're doing is it seems like they're going to give Benjamin a chance. They're going to give Benjamin a chance to police themselves, in a sense, to allow Benjamin to say, okay, this thing should not have happened within us. We're going to help take care of this issue. But whenever they sent men throughout the tribe of Benjamin, verse 8, saying, what is this evil act that has happened among you? Hand over the wicked men in Gibeah so we can put them to death and eradicate evil from Israel. But notice the Benjaminites' reaction. The Benjaminites would not listen to their fellow Israelites. Instead, the Benjaminites gathered together from their cities to Gibeah to go out and fight against the Israelites. And notice that language. That language is so crazy to say that the Benjaminites are going to gather and fight against Israel. That's like saying my hand's going to fight against me. I mean, it's a part of me. It should be working in unison. It should be working together. But that's not the case at all, because on that day, verse 15, the Benjaminites mobilized 26,000 armed men from their cities, besides 700 fit young men rallied by the inhabitants of Gibeah. And there were 700 fit young men who were left-handed among all the troops. All could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. Quick trivia, test your knowledge, Alan. Who is the Benjaminite we've seen so far who is left-handed? That was a judge.
Ehud.
That's right. That's right. And notice the language that's mentioned here. The left-handedness is almost always a signal of being a strong warrior. But notice this, that they were stone slingers, and that they could sling a stone, and they can shoot at a single hair and not miss. These were very strong warriors, which is kind of setting us up for what's going to happen, because we probably think initially that 11 tribes versus
1 versus 11 seems lopsided.
This is going to be a slaughter, one particular way. We're all being led to one particular way. But here's the first hint, I think, that things aren't necessarily going to go the way we think they're going to go. So verse 17, the Israelites, apart from Benjamin, mobilized 400,000 armed men. Every one of them was an experienced warrior. And they set out and they went to Bethel. First thing we want to notice, and inquired of God. So there is an inquiry of God, Alan. But let's notice what the inquiry is. The Israelites ask, who is the first to fight for us against the Benjaminites? You noted the connection there from 1:1, chapter 1 and verse 1. Nearly the exact same language is used, but let's compare real fast. I'm going to read, listen to what I say, look at the screen, notice the difference here. The Israelites inquired of the Lord, who will be the first for us to fight against the Canaanites. Literally, I think, Alan, it's word for word, except for one. Benjaminites versus Canaanites. They have the exact same mentality here as they had in chapter 1. They are treating their own brothers as if they are Canaanites. Alan, why would this be a thing that is even remotely had the possibility of happening?
Well, I mean, the Benjamites, I mean, specifically Gibeah, have acted like Canaanites. So,
right.
So they need to be treated that way. One thing I took from this is, I mean, this is a pretty big number of men, 400,000 armed men. We'll see later on this particular story likely was actually kind of early on in the Judges period. You mentioned how this is not necessarily chronological. It's, they're not placed in order of
right.
What happened first. So this isn't like the end of the Judges period. This is likely really toward the beginning. And we see, stories like Samson that seem to take place a little toward the end of the Judges period. And we see the state of Israel during that time. I mean, they're hiding in rocks and they're just subdued by the Philistines or whoever it is, the Midianites.
Uh-huh.
Well, look where they kind of started with, pretty soon after probably the death of Joshua. I mean, they're at 400,000 strong. That's enough to, I mean, the Canaanites were powerful, but this wasn't a huge land with, millions and millions of people. I mean, 400,000 men should have been more than enough to, completely conquer and destroy all these Canaanites. And yet we see that never happened. And then, that leads to times, like during Samson when they're, hiding in the rocks, or Gideon when he's, threshing in a wine press because he's afraid of the Midianites. Um, the other difference, you mentioned the one difference in that statement in verse 18, Benjamites versus Israelites. Well, God's answer is a little bit different too. Here he says, and the Lord answered, right at the end of verse 18, Judah will be first. And that's it. In chapter
Yes.
1 and verse 2, it's very similar. The Lord answered, Judah is to go. I have handed the land over to him.
Right.
So, I mean, if you're comparing those two, you're like, okay, I mean, you might think, okay, the Lord's given his blessing, he's going to be with them. Well, is that what he said? Or he just said, send Judah first? So, as we'll see, I think you get the sense that they're definitely not asking in the right way, or, asking the right questions. And I mean, think about their attitude, okay, they've mobilized, they're basically like surrounding Gibeah already. And then they're like, oh yeah, we should go ask God,
It's
can
an
we go
afterthought
first?
almost.
I mean, it's like asking forgiveness instead of permission after the fact. They've already pretty much made their decisions. They're doing it. Oh, let me ask God. So we, give him, like we asked permission first. And, I think that's the idea here. And we'll see God's going to, even though he answers here and gives them, tells them that Judah will be first, this isn't necessarily a, okay, you have my blessing on this endeavor, because obviously disaster strikes in the next few verses.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think there's a very big difference between what we have here with this conquest in a sense, and what took place at the beginning of the book. Because prior to the opening of Judges, we have the book of Joshua. And the Joshua story is all about setting them up to do what they're going to do in chapter 1 and verse 1. This was the plan all along. It was always the plan for them to go and to conquer. This is not the same sort of issue. This is not the same sort of situation. This was not a plan. This is a reaction to what has taken place. And I think you're absolutely correct to note here, there is no inquiry of if it should happen. It is an assumed that it should. Now the only question is how or who. So it's a who question instead of a should question,
Mm-hmm.
which we're going to see as this progresses, that the question is going to change.
Yeah.
And their reaction is going to change. And I believe that shows us the accuracy of seeing this initial inquiry from this particular perspective. As you said, the Lord answered, Judah will be first. So in the morning, the Israelites set out and camped near Gibeah, and the men of Israel went out to fight against Benjamin and took their battle positions against Gibeah. And the Benjaminites came out of Gibeah and slaughtered 22,000 men of Israel on the field that day. But the Israelite troops rallied and again took their positions in the same place where they positioned themselves on the first day. They went up and wept before the Lord until evening and inquired of him. Notice the change here. Should we again attack our brothers, the Benjaminites? They go up the first time, Alan.
Mm-hmm.
They give an effort against Gibeah. They're driven back. So now they return. Originally, they just go up. Then they simply make an inquiry. Who? Now they go up. They're crying. They're asking should, and they're giving more specific information. Our brother, the Benjaminites. The Lord answered, fight against them. Keep going. So on the second day, the Israelites advanced against the Benjaminites. And the same day, the Benjaminites came out of Gibeah to meet them and slaughtered an additional 18,000 Israelites on the field. All were armed. The response? The whole Israelite army went to Bethel, where they wept and sat before the Lord. They fasted that day until evening and offered burnt offerings and fellowship offerings to the Lord. And then the Israelites inquired of the Lord. In those days, the ark of the covenant of God was there, and Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, was serving before it. And the Israelites asked, should we again fight against our brothers, the Benjaminites, or should we stop? Alan, what's different from the first to the second to the third instance here, and expound a little more upon the fact that Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, is mentioned here? He must be a super old man, right?
It probably, but I'm seeing a lot of parallels with an earlier story that sounds similar. I think of when the second major city they took in after coming into the land. They first took Jericho. Well, then the very next chapter they go to attack Ai, and they completely underestimate the situation, and they don't inquire of God,
Mhm.
and there's disaster. The first attack against Ai, they're defeated, and men die. So you have the same kind of thing here again. They didn't inquire of God. They had sin among them that, ensured that God was not with them, and they were defeated. Same thing's happening here. And it takes, it takes a third time to finally, uh, I think, get them humble enough and get them, asking the right questions here. And yeah, I mean, we still have Phineas. I mean, so this is likely taking place, one or two generations. I mean, there's Phineas was around for Ai, so there's plenty of men there that would have remembered that story, would have been contemporaries with Joshua or Moses himself. So we're not talking about a very long time, and we're already seeing this kind of uh, this boldness by the Israelites, and willingness to go attack without properly humbling themselves before God and asking. You mentioned the difference, I think, between the questions. Obviously, the first one was just, who's going to fight first, not should we fight. We get that a little more in the second one. Should we again attack our brothers, the Benjamites? Uh, it, Even though there's should, you get the sense that this is more like we're going to attack. You know,
I agree. It's
yeah,
essentially
it's
we're,
not
we're
like
going
it,
to do it. We just hope you give us your blessing.
yeah, and then finally we get to should we fight or should we stop? We're asked at real. They're finally asking God's opinion of this. I think before they weren't really asking much opinion. They were just kind of doing lip service. But now you get the sense that it's a little more humble. They were even though they wept before, that seemed to be more lip service because obviously uh, God wasn't really with them. And now we get the answer: fight, because I will hand them over to you tomorrow. Just the same as uh, chapter 1 when he told Judah, fight against them. I've handed the land over to him. So you get the full. The Lord was kind of. He didn't completely. I don't want to say he didn't answer the question. He answered their question. Just you know he just told them to go fight. He didn't say he's going to be with them until now. Now they can have assurances that that God would be with them and they would have victory.
Yeah, it's here in this moment, Alan, that I see them finally asking permission.
Mm-hmm.
They're finally wondering, is this something we ought to even be doing? Initially, it was just the assumption we're going to do it. Okay, it didn't quite go the way we want to, but we still want to fight. Now they're wondering, do we even really want to fight? Do we want to? Lord, should we do this thing? Which I think are spot on. He gives finally that real confirmation from that you see back in chapter 1 in verse 2. Whenever we look at this, Alan, and what we're going to see in just a second is the complete just slaughter of the Benjaminites at this point. But what we're seeing as we look at the story as a whole is that God is not Israel's friend in this moment. He's not giving them a blessing of any sort, really, because everything that's taken place up to this point has been evil and wicked, and has not been according to his desires. Again, looking at what Way mentions about this, you look at chapters 1 through 7. God raises up deliverers, judges, warlords. He raises them up, and he uses them as weapons against Israel's enemies in order to bring peace. And he releases his spirit upon these judges, and they act accordingly. In chapters 6 through 18, he continues to deliver Israel, but as he's doing so, he's not doing it in the same way. There isn't this blessing sort of perception that we ought to see. He's doing so in a more indirect way, it seems, and things are just getting messier. Then you get to 17 through 19, and God is almost completely passive and withdrawn. There's very few mentions of him within that text. And then here we get to 20 and 21, and it's a complete reversal of what we see originally from 1 through 7. Now God is not using judges to punish Canaanites. he's using Israel itself to punish Israel. And that is because Israel has now become Canaan. They've now become nothing different than pagans because of the way that they're behaving and the way they're going out their business, which is why we have such just a really ugly, I mean, it's really ugly, really sad text from 30 on to the end of the chapter, Alan, of what takes place here. Why don't you just give us a good paraphrase of what's going on here? You're really good at that, giving good summaries.
Well, we mentioned the story of Ai before, and there's a lot of similarities with this battle tactic. I mean, they kind of go, they pretend like they're getting defeated and flee, and they try to draw the Benjamites away from their defensive position. Seems like they were, staying in the cities and using that strong defensive position to victory. So they draw them out of the city, just like they drew the men of Ai out of the city. And, they even, kind of sacrificed a few of their own. It says in verse 31, about 30 men of Israel were killed, and just enough to give the Benjamites, give them the false hope that they were going to win again. And then, they have this, this kind of ambush set behind them. And so they leave part of their men back, and they make a frontal assault, verse 34, against Gibeah. The battle was fierce, and the Benjamites that had chased after the first group didn't know that disaster was about to strike. So they basically kind of surround the Benjamites, and eventually they kill, 25,000 of them. I think, let me look back here. How many were there at the beginning? Let's see.
Going back to verse 15, there was about 26,000 total.
Yeah, so 26,000 men of Benjamin and 700 men of Gibeah. All right, so down here we're at verse 35. So they knock out 25, all but 900 men of Benjamin, and it seems like they completely destroy Gibeah. They put the whole city to the sword. That's another interesting thing there. I mean, this wasn't just they're fighting the men, the men of Gibeah that were the wicked ones. I mean, they're slaughtering the entire tribe. I mean, men, women, and children as well.
Yeah, it seems like they're consuming themselves, like they're going to plunder Gibeah and just take everything for themselves. It doesn't seem to be purely retribution.
Yeah,
but they're going to try to benefit themselves in some way as well.
They burn the city. I mean, there's no reason to destroy property and things like that. I mean, I think they've gotten out of control here. There's no, we don't hear of any leadership, anything like that that's leading this group. It's just, all right, everyone, let's go attack them. We don't know of any general, or we're given the name of Phineas, but seems like he's, if he was out there leading the army, we'd know about it because he's done that before. Mm-hmm. So he's probably, like you mentioned, too old to really be a active leader anymore, even though he's still around. So they continue to pursue him. Verse 43. See, there are 18,000 who died from Benjamin. Verse 44. That's not just the men. We already know that the men were killed, 25,000 of them. So they kill another 18,000. I mean, that's the non-fighting folk right there. Well, never mind. It says all were warriors. Scratch that.
I think what we see there, beginning of verse 43, is a
breakdown. That's right.
Expounding upon what they did, what's mentioned in 35.
Yeah,
because the numbers add up to right at 25,000.
So they wrap it up here, 25,000. They're all the armed men. 600 escaped to this rock and stayed there for a while, and that's going to be important. This 600 that did survive.
Yeah, you were talking, Alan, about just kind of the unrestrained nature of what they're doing here. They're just kind of flying by the seat of their pants. I think there's further evidence for that type of attitude and mindset of what's going on here, based upon what we see in verse 20 in chapter 21. The fact that now, after they've done all this, they're having to turn around and say, "Uh-oh, we messed up. We took it too far. Not only did we kill the men, but now we've killed all the women, and basically Benjamin's going to be dunzos. Yeah. I mean, they're gone. There's going to be no future for the Benjaminites because they're not going to have wives. Again, we're going to talk about that on Friday, chapter 21, and also give a wrap up of judges as well at that moment. But I think you're right. The language here and what takes place seems to lead us to think that they were just bloodthirsty. They were seeing red and just going to kill anything and everything that moved that was associated with the Benjaminites.
And it said right at the end, they burned all the cities that remained. I mean, all of Benjamin, the whole territory is punished, not just Gibeah. Like, okay, I can understand, wiping out the city of Gibeah, even the women and children, you just want to purge that. But spreading that to the entire nation of Benjamin, or the entire tribe of Benjamin, definitely seems like a step too far. And
you know what's said about that, Alan? Is what were they commanded to do originally with the Canaanites? Wipe them out completely, right?
Yeah, wipe them out completely, and they finally do that, but only to Benjamin.
They don't. Yeah, they don't do it. they don't do that whenever it's the true enemy, but once it's their own people, then they're willing to do such thing, and it just really shows us the backwards nature of the way Israel operates within the book of the Judges. We, again, as a Westerner, someone 21st century, as we're reading books, Alan, we want things to go in sequential order.
Mm-hmm.
We want them to be very linear. This happens, leads to this, leads to this, leads to that. We like to see things that way. So we might come to Judges, we might read this, say, okay, well, this is just the icing on the cake. This just shows how bad they've gotten. When in reality, that timestamp of Phinehas being the priest at that time, that shows us that this was early on, and might actually show. Let me back up for a second. We read earlier, one of the earlier chapters, that this book, more than likely, I apologize if you can hear my daughters and they're yelling. They're toddlers. Let's see, into chapter 18 seems to give evidence this was a book that was written later on, before the exile, or at least sometime around the exile. And as I could see this being written as an explanation of why the exile is taking place.
Mm-hmm.
Why is this happening? Here's why it's happening. The people have been rebellious from the beginning, and the book is written. The judges are written about, and somebody sitting reading this for the first time and thinking, man, why did things get this bad? And then they get to chapters 17 and 18, and they read about these priests like, wow, even the priests have turned bad. Then they get to 19 and read about this priest like, wow, the priest really did get super bad. And then we get to 20, and they get down to what we call verse 28, and they're thinking, hold on, when did this happen? This happened early on? Oh, now we know why they were so bad.
Mm-hmm.
They were so bad because the leadership was bad. The leadership is what allowed all of this to take place. And if you tie that in with what is said in many of the prophets about the failures of the leadership of Israel that led to their demise, now we can maybe see the purpose for the book of the Judges, why it's written to begin with, and then more specifically why it's structured, why it was written in this certain way, and why the structure leads us to understand the history of Israel in a better sense, and leads us to know why things happened the way they ended up happening. Go ahead,
it's
Alan.
interesting
with
Phinehas too being there. I mean, we've read enough about him. I mean, he's clearly we remember about the time with in Moab before they crossed over, and the sin with the Moabites, and he zealously killed the man that was sinning with the Moabite woman. They took a spear and stabbed her, and basically helped save Israel from the plague. And then later on, we see him kind of being a leader during the days, very soon after Joshua, being we don't really see much negative about Phinehas. Well, here he is. He's mentioned, I think, more as a timestamp than anything, and then he's left out of the rest of the story. So, assuming that obviously he could have turned bad at some point, and just he'd have been all for this, and wasn't a good leader after all. But even if he was, it kind of sounds like he was, even though he was still there, he was probably advising against doing all this stuff, and they just weren't listening. So this isn't necessarily just an absence of good leadership. Sometimes they did have them, and they didn't listen to them, and they didn't follow them. I mean, how many times throughout the judges? I mean, not that all the judges were great, but when they were around, some of the time, like Gideon, the Ephraimites were kind of fighting against him, or Jephthah. There was even civil war during that time. So even when you did have these guys, that were appointed or raised up by God, you didn't really have, people following them. So it's just, I mean, it's just a mixture of, poor leadership, no leadership, or good leadership that wasn't even followed. They'd rather follow the Abimelechs and the Levite, the unnamed Levites of the world instead of following good one. And that's going to lead even into our next book, with First Samuel. You have some good leaders like Samuel, and then you have guys like Saul that they would rather follow instead. You had a good one in Samuel. Oh, we'd rather have a king. Well, let's get Saul in here, and he turns out to be a disaster. And then you finally get to, you're crying out for 3-4 books trying to get to a good leader again after, losing Moses and Joshua. And you finally get to David, but I mean, there's probably at least 300 or 400 years in between those two guys. So this whole period is just rough.
And that is a absolutely perfect segue into our next study on Friday, Alan. Talk about chapter 21, because the most famous product of Gibeah is who?
It'll be Saul.
King Saul. But here's the problem: all the women are gone. So who is going to be here for these 600 Benjaminites for them to marry and produce children with? That's the question. That's the problem they're facing. We're going to talk about that more on Friday. Get into the solution to the problem that they have created for themselves, which seems to be par for the course for the Israelites. We're going to talk about how they seek to remedy that issue, and we'll also do a wrap up after we finish up with chapter 21. Just again looking at a quick overview of the book of the Judges to see what we learn from it. Of course, for today, what we understand as being really important and taking away kind of as lessons from the study is, number one, poor leadership is going to get you in a bad position. Poor leadership is going to get you in a bad position. Also, just recognizing that this chapter happened because of selfishness and because of arrogance, because of pride of the unnamed Levite. And then also, I think a takeaway is make sure that we're really, really relying upon God for what we do, not just making assumptions and not trying to, in our own minds, get the right answer we want out of God, but to truly rely upon him and do as he would have us to do. I think if the Israelites would have done that from the get-go, things probably would have been better for them. But alas, we are where we are here in Judges chapter 20. Alan, anything else before we finish out today?
Yeah, I like thinking about that point in terms of our own, own times today and our own, leadership as elders, deacons, preachers, fathers, whatever. Do we act, do what we want and then come back and inquire of the Lord later? Or, obviously I can't sit down and, go to Mizpah or go to Bethel and inquire the same way they did, but we can pray, we can study, we can meditate, we can have patience as we're trying to make a decision, especially one in regards like as a, if you're an elder, as having regards to the church, go through those steps of inquiring of God. I'd be surprised if you go through all of those properly and you still don't come up with the right answer one way or the other. But if we don't do that with the proper attitude, if we're coming, paying lip service, pretending like we're asking when we've already made up our minds to do something, then disaster will strike and we'll fail. So it wasn't until the Israelites truly came with a humble and a soft heart that they received the answer of what they should do, and then they had victory. So I think that lesson can apply to us even today.
Yeah, absolutely. Great thoughts, Alan. Great thoughts. Thank you so much for being with us today, Alan, and giving us your great insight. And for those who have joined us in this study, thank you for being here as well. Hope that you have benefited from it. Again, if you have any questions or comments, please leave that for us. We'd love to interact with you, answer those things, and speak about this text or any other spiritual questions you might have. We hope that you have a great rest of your Tuesday. May God bless you in all that you do. If you're looking for a church to study with tomorrow night, we are planning on meeting at 7 p.m. to continue our adult study in Ecclesiastes, and then we'll have kids classes as well tomorrow night, 7 p.m., 384 Pleasant Plains Road. You're more than happy or more than welcome to join us in person, or you could join us here on Facebook or YouTube. We'll be streaming those as well. Again, thank you for joining us. Have a great rest of your day. God bless you and all that you do. Take care and join us next time as we continue our walk through history, the story of God's word as found within the Bible. We're going to wrap up Judges on Friday. Hope you could join us for that. Take care and God bless.